I never know where the ideas come from, but thankfully they come. And when they come, especially that strongly, you have to sort of seize the moment and write it when you can before it goes cold on you. You know, David Benioff and Dan Weiss, who are the showrunners, are really the best people to answer this question. I don't know. My understanding is that the Reeds will eventually come in probably during the third season. Thoros has already been referred to in dialogue, so he certainly exists in the world. He may come in the third season as well, but I can't speak to that quite as authoritatively. You know, certain characters do have to be eliminated. We already have the largest cast of continuing characters on television, and if you know the books, the number of characters just gets larger and larger with every book as the characters spread out across the world, and each of them encounters new civilizations and new cities and new peoples. So that's the challenge for Benioff and Weiss and for HBO, as to how to keep that under control, because obviously it's harder to do. You know, in writing a book, I can have as many characters as I want. Doing a television show, each of those characters requires an actor. Each of those actors wants to be paid. It can add up pretty quickly, even if they're relatively minor parts. So that's what David and Dan have to deal with, and I'm grateful that it's their problem and not my problem. Well, I loved all of those shows, and I'm proud of my work on them, but Game of Thrones has to be my favorite. I mean, Game of Thrones is my baby. These are my characters. I created, you know, the world of Westeros. I created Dany and Tyrion and all of these people. Beauty and the Beast, I worked on that for all 3 years, and I did add some characters to that mix, but it was Ron Coslow's show. It was Vincent and Catherine and Father and the Underworld. Those were all his creations, and I was very pleased and proud to be able to live in it and work in it and create stories for them for 3 years. But still, no matter how much you might admire someone else's kid, you love your own kids best. These characters in this world are very, very real to me, and I remember them surprisingly well. Sometimes I like to say it must be because there's something wrong with my brain, and I devote a large part of it that other people use to remember real people, to remember these fictional made-up people that I have. That's right, yes, I live with them, I know them, you know, I'll meet people today and I'll forget them tomorrow in real life, you know, but even minor characters in Westeros, I can see them in my mind's eye. I know how they dress and how they talk and what they look like. You know, nasty bits of business in some ways, but when you write about them and you get inside their head, and you're living with them, you identify them with a certain extent. You understand why they're as nasty as they are, and the particular demons that drive them, and it's hard not to feel a certain empathy and compassion for them in that case. Which doesn't mean that I won't kill them or maim them or do horrible things to them. You know, the story is the master. The story has to come first. The Red Wedding in book 3 is the hardest thing I ever wrote. I had planned it right from the very beginning. Even in 1991, when I was first starting it, I knew that this would eventually be part of the story. But when I reached it in the third book, it occurs about 2/3 of the way through the book, but I didn't write it when I reached it. I couldn't write it. I skipped over it. Finally, when the whole book was done, except for that, I went back and I made myself write that scene. It was very, very painful scene to write, but you know, pain is part of the process. So, but you know, there's certainly twists and turns in the plotting, and the level of magic comes up. You know, we've introduced the character of Melisandre, the Red Priestess of Ashai, in the second season, and she achieves increasing importance. And I know coming up very soon we have the scene that some of my book fans call the shadow baby scene. So that's going to be something to behold on screen. And we have the Battle of the Blackwater coming up, which should be amazing. And the episode that I wrote, episode 9, where the two great armies clash on the Blackwater Rush south of King's Landing, and that's partly a naval battle and partly a land battle, and it's a city under siege, and it's an hour battle. I don't think there's anything like it ever been done for television before. It's you know, obviously compared to a feature film, the budget was small, but for a television production, the budget was huge. We have a lot of extras, we have a lot of special effects in that episode. We got Neil Marshall to direct it, which we're very excited about. He's a British feature film director who's never done television before. More fantasy, yes, definitely. In every season and every book, the fantasy element comes up a little. You know, I started small and it increases. But that being said, even where I arrive at the end is going to be less fantasy than in some other fantasies out there. I mean, compared to the average fantasy book on the stands, A Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire is quite low fantasy. I think in a fantasy book you need some magic, you need some sorcery and wonder and some of this strange stuff, but you can't have too much of it or it overwhelms the story. And the story still has to be grounded in reality with a judicious addition of the supernatural and the mysterious. Too much of it trivializes it. And we have a budget. It's a very substantial budget for television. HBO spends a lot more on its shows than the American broadcast networks do. But it's still a television budget. It can't rival the budget of a big feature film like Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. So we have limitations there too. But within the context of those limitations, David and Dan and HBO are doing an incredibly faithful adaptation. They're taking my story and they're translating it to a different medium. They're not just taking elements of my story or just taking the title of my story and putting in a whole different story under the title, which you see other people do occasionally in TV and film. So I'm very pleased with the faithfulness. My favorite child is Tyrion. I've always enjoyed writing him the most. I appreciate his wit, but I love all the others too, even the bad boys and the flawed ones. The fact that Tyrion is my favorite doesn't mean that I'm not going to maim or torture or torment him. However, I think that's something that you have to do to keep the story moving and to keep your character in the center of it. I put a lot of time into my characters and a lot of effort and try to portray them as fully fleshed human beings. One of the drawbacks of much of published fantasy has been that the characters are very shallow. They're heroes or they're villains. They're all white or they're all black. They're champions of good or they're unspeakably evil. Most real human beings are not like that. When I look around, I see, you know, the capacity for good and evil in all of us. All of us are capable of acts of heroism under certain conditions. All of us are capable of acts of cowardice or selfishness under other conditions. Sometimes the same person can do something very heroic on Tuesday and something very selfish and venal on Wednesday. I'm not a mystical person. I'm a science fiction person. You know, I wrote science fiction before I wrote fantasy. There's an element of strong rationalization to me. I want to see proof. Don't tell me about your gods and all that until you can actually demonstrate their actual existence. At the same time, there's a hunger in me for, you know, I would like to find some evidence of gods or an afterlife or something like that. I find them fascinating topics. I write about them. I read about the effect that religion has on people, and it's certainly a big element in Game of Thrones. You know, not only the faith of the Seven, the old gods of the North, and Melisandre and her new proselytizing religion, the dualist religion of the Lord of Light and a great other, and the decisions that people make. But that really comes from my study of history, where, you know, you read about the wars of religion and Catholics and Protestants and Christianity versus Islam and the sorts of wars and atrocities and butcheries and, you know, the Inquisition, which you guys had here, is amazing that the things that people do in part of this loving God who made us all, and we're all his children, right? And so let me shove this hot poker into you because you don't say the prayers the same way I do. Religion is a fascinating topic, but I'm not religious myself. I'm very skeptical. And there will be no, although religion will continue to be an important part in the books, at no point will the gods show up in person to take a hand in affairs. There may be mysterious goings on, and some of the characters may say, oh, the god has answered my prayer, but is it really the god? Or I don't know. I'll leave that to the readers to decide. The writers who influenced me most are the writers I read when I was still a kid, a teenager. Robert A. Heinlein, first book I ever read, Have Spacesuit Will Travel, science fiction book, juvenile. Great book still, I reread that every few years. Tolkien, of course, Tolkien. Even before Tolkien, Robert E. Howard, Conan the Cimmerian, and even more Solomon Kane, who's my favorite Robert E. Howard character, one of the great writers of sword and sorcery. Jack Vance, my favorite living science fiction fantasy writer. I've edited an anthology of tribute stories to Jack Vance and his Dying Earth universe. Brilliant writer, a great stylist of science fiction and fantasy. No one writes like Jack Vance. These are all writers who have influenced me, and there are also others outside of the field. I mean, I read a lot of historical fiction. In the old days, people like Thomas B. Costain and Frank Yerby. Today, people like Bernard Cornwell and Stephen Pressfield have had an influence. Some of the classics of the novel, of literature, The Great Gatsby is probably one of my favorite novels by F. Scott Fitzgerald. He's another writer who I yearn to emulate in some ways. Brilliant writer. So, you know, there's so many. I could list another 20 here if I got going. So to be compared to him is, you know, I'm being mentioned in the same breath as a man whose work I really admire, and that's, you know, that's a great compliment to me, and I'm deeply honored by that. On the other hand, I'm not at all like Tolkien, so if people read the American Tolkien and they pick up my book expecting the same thing, I know that they're going to be disappointed, and some of them may even be angry, because what I'm doing is very different from what Tolkien was doing. I don't need to do what Tolkien was doing. Tolkien did it.